He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 1983 with a bachelor's in international relations and European history. He also has a master's from Harvard's Davis Center for Russian Studies and a master's in national security studies from the Army War College. Please join me in welcoming Philip Wasielewski.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Before I begin my prepared remarks here, I just want to say a couple of things informally. First off, what a great thing it is that we have groups like this. And I was just talking to Dave before that groups like the World Affairs Council are really necessary for us as Americans in our civil society. You hear we have another election cycle coming up soon if we're not in it already. And you'll hear people say, well, people really don't care about foreign affairs and elections and things like that. And I'd like to disagree, because those of you who've been around for a few years know that many of the most important events that shape our country have been our intercourse with other nations around the world. You think of not just the wars we've been involved in, but our trade, our economics, the things that we value. So things like the World Affairs Council, other groups like this, participation of citizens, across America is very, very much important for us, because when it comes time in the voting booth to make decisions about how we will spend our blood and treasure, and for those of you who, pay taxes, and that's probably just about everyone in the room, and for those of you who may, ever be called upon for military service or decide to volunteer, and that these are important questions that we talk about no matter what it is. And you just have to open up the newspaper. We just heard about Israel and Ukraine, but many, many other places around the world, of which the United States and its interactions are important. And talking about these things, understanding these things for all citizens, I think, is just as important as understanding the domestic side of our politics. So kudos to all, for belonging to an organization like this, and for the people who run an organization like this. Okay, let me get into my talk. And whenever I talk to a group, just to give myself an idea of the audience's background and the subject I'm going to speak about, I ask for a show of hands. So let's start off with a show of hands. Okay, how many remember the Soviet Union? Okay, oh good, okay. How many have read the Communist Manifesto or any of the works of Lenin or Stalin? I use my left hand when I'm analyzing for that one. All right. How many have read the novel 1984 by George Orwell? Great. I've not read it all, but my daughter has to read it now in high school. That's great. Well, don't worry if you haven't raised your hand for these questions, because we're going to go down memory lane in this talk, because what was once old is new again with regards to Russia. Will Russia survive till 2084? That's an odd question, isn't it? I mean, it's a country that's been around for 1,000 years, and I'm asking, will it survive for another few decades? What exactly am I asking about in my question, and where does this question come from? Because there's a background to it. I wrote the article, Will Russia Survive Till 2084, for Foreign Policy Research Institute about a year ago. The article's title is an allusion to Andrei Amalrik's historic 1969 essay, Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984? Amalrik, a Soviet dissident, wrote his essay in 1969 after several years in exile in Siberia, and just as China and the Soviet Union began fighting a series of border clashes which would kill hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers on both sides. Amalrik dissented from the Soviet system, hence the term dissident, because of the inherent contradictions of communism he witnessed all around him. The supposedly classless society of the Soviet Union had its own class system. The workers' paradise was a hell for actual workers, and the state, instead of withering away as Karl Marx had predicted and wrote, was growing constantly and strangling society. It was with this background that Amalrik wrote his essay. Amalrik believed that the Soviet Union, like Imperial Russia before it, was in a pre-revolutionary situation due to, and let me quote exactly here, a caste-ridden and immobile society, a rigid governmental system which openly clashes with the need for economic development, general bureaucratization, and the existence of a privileged bureaucratic class, and national animosities within multinational state in which certain nations enjoy privileged status. That was Amalrik's evaluation in 1969. I'll tell you, if you read his essay, it's also a pretty good evaluation of Russia today, in my opinion. Amalrik saw little hope for Soviet society instigating revolution from below. In his view, there were only three possible futures for the Soviet Union. One was real reform, which he dismissed as impossible. The second was a military coup that shed the outer garments of Marxist-Leninism and transitioned to an openly nationalist policy. Or, his third option, the breakup of the Soviet Union along nationalist lines due to a long and bloody war with China. He knew that unsuccessful wars had brought down past regimes and believed war with China would push the Soviet regime into oblivion. Well, he was right about option three. That is how the Soviet Union fell apart. It did not have a long war with China, although it did have a bloody war in Afghanistan, which some say was close enough. When the Soviet Union fell apart, it fell apart along national lines. The 15 separate Soviet socialist republics became independent countries. However, I'd also like to mention that if you look at option two, what he talked about, if you replace military coup with a secret service coup or security service coup, this option is probably what has happened to Russia since the advent of Putin. So as a if he was a baseball player, Amalrik would have been batting .667 for a career. Amalrik, who died in 1980, did not live to see the eventual vindication of his thesis when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. While some contend that he was an accidental prophet, Amalrik had the foresight to look beyond the Soviet Union's facade of omnipotence and discern that the empire had no clothes. Amalrik may not have had the exact path picked out, but he certainly knew the Soviet Union's final destination. It was the awareness of this essay that I read as an undergraduate back in the early 80s, and my own experiences in the former Soviet Union in the 1990s and 2000s that led me to form a very similar thesis about the Russian Federation. I saw a Russia that was declining demographically and economically, while I also saw, especially when I was in Central Asia, a China rising not just in military and economic strength, but also in self-confidence. My essay is derived from those impressions and an attempt to update Amalrik's question for Russia today. I originally started this after I retired from CIA. I retired on New Year's Eve of 2020. So I began writing this in 2021, and I originally entitled it, Will Putin Survive Till 2024? Will Russia Survive Till 2084? And in that first draft, I noted the growing problems in the Russian economy, as well as the great economic and demographic differences between Russia and China. My conclusion was that Putin was strong enough to last to 2024 due to the strength of the police and secret police systems in Russia, unless he manifestly mismanaged a crisis. I was less optimistic that Russia would last to 2084 in its current form due to her decreasing population and economic strength and China's massive population, economic and military strength, and past claims on territory in Russia's Far East. I'm going to get into that a little bit more later in the talk here. Naturally, this is my first attempt of writing in retirement. My essay was rejected by every magazine I submitted it to, including Orbis, which is the magazine of the think tank Foreign Policy Research Institute that I'm affiliated with now. However, after the war in Ukraine began, I reevaluated my earlier work based on the strains that the war had brought to Russia's government and society and rewrote it. Let me share with you the three main conclusions, not too different from my first draft of my article. The first conclusion in my article is, if the Russian army collapses in defeat in Ukraine, this could be a catalyst for political violence seeking regime or leadership change to extract revenge for humiliation on the battlefield and ruined economy at home. However, as the number of armed groups in Russia grows, regular military, security services, private military companies, ethnic nationalist military units, etc., political violence initially focused on the Kremlin could spread and unleash a broader struggle as each group vies for power against each other. My second conclusion, if Russia's central government, with a defeated army and weakened security services, is convulsed in an armed power struggle, this could motivate some ethnic autonomous republics within Russia to take advantage of this opportunity and attempt to secede, which would plunge the state into further chaos. And if that's not enough, number three, even if a defeat in Ukraine does not lead to disintegration within Russia itself, the former Soviet republics in what Russia considers its near abroad will continue to spin away from Moscow's sphere of influence and reorient themselves towards other historic powers in their regions. This will be especially true in Central Asia and the Caucasus, where Chinese and Turkish power has risen or re-risen over the past several decades, while Russia's has declined. In Russia's Far East, the disparity between China and Russia's relative strengths, military, economic, and demographic, has turned the balance of power in Beijing's favor. Now let me go into each point in a little bit of detail, but still leave plenty of time for questions at the end here. First, what does it mean by Russia loses the war in Ukraine? I see that as meaning either its army collapses on the battlefield and mutinies a la 1917, think of the various scenes from the great movie Dr. Zhivago, or it loses Crimea back to Ukraine. If that happens, there will be hell to pay, to use the technical political science term, in the Kremlin from both the military and the general population for such a humiliating turn of events. We already saw in July of this year, with Prigozhin's march on Moscow, that discipline amongst Russia's various armed groups is not ironclad, nor is its loyalty to Putin. There are so many different armed groups in Russia today, and each reporting to different leaders with their own political backings, that it is not impossible that political violence could break out and spread across the country. Defeat will have many groups demanding accountability. For example, you'll have military officers deflecting blame. You'll have average soldiers seeking retribution for their suffering and their sacrifices. You'll have families who have lost loved ones or who must now care for their wounded, wanting to know what this was all about. Russian society will be angry at a lost war and a ruined economy. If victory has 100 fathers, as John Kennedy once said, and defeat is an orphan, that orphan's name will be Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Therefore, Putin could face either public uprising seeking regime change or a palace coup attempting to appease public outrage with leadership change, vice regime change, so that Kremlin elites do not lose their wealth and security. Now, that I've opened the bottle for the genie of possibility of coup and political violence in Russia, let's consider just generally options and scenarios. Consider this. Even if a coup removes Putin from power, would its leader or leaders be able to balance the competing factions, including armed ones, as Putin once did? There is no promise that other armed elements would accept the legitimacy of a coup and not try to seize power themselves from the coup makers. What if Putin survives? What if there's a coup? Putin escapes. He survives a coup attempt and rallies supporters. What then of the loyalties of the various armed groups in Russia? It could be a short step from coup to civil war, with various factions battling across Russia. Indeed, never before has Russia been awash in so many armed units, military, paramilitary, police, private, as today. major domestic disorder could unravel parts of Russia, specifically its ethnic republics. This brings me to my second point. In 1991, when the Soviet Union, when all Soviet socialistic republics quit the Soviet Union, they left behind 21 non-Slavic autonomous republics, in other words, smaller in size, but still not that small, in Russia, each with their own constitution, their own capital, and their own national language. In other words, many states ready to become international states, just like the Soviet socialist republics are, which are now the countries of Ukraine, Lithuania, Turkmenistan, and the like. Okay. The Chechen Autonomous Republic tried and failed to secede from Russia after 2 bloody wars. This stopped other ethnic republics from trying to follow its example. If a breakdown in public order, even civil war, occurs in Russia after defeat in Ukraine, might Chechnya and other republics be motivated to try again? Now, the primary motivation for independence movements in the modern world is nationalism, the belief that a distinct people should have their own sovereign nation state. Nationalism remains strong among Russia's many ethnic groups and is visible from the Chechen Wars, which I just mentioned, to regular skirmishes between the autonomous republics and Moscow over education, national languages, the extent of self-rule, and control over indigenous natural resources. The war in Ukraine has led to protests in many autonomous ethnic republics over mobilization and high casualties among non-ethnic Russians. Now, however motivated, ethnic republics are unlikely to arise without the confidence they could survive economically and not be crushed by Moscow. The memory of what happened in Chechnya is strong. Geographically, however, this is possible. Geographically, 7 North Caucasus republics with approximately 7 million people and energy resources of oil, gas, and coal have borders contiguous to Georgia and Azerbaijan. In other words, access to the rest of the world. Kalmykia is contiguous to this grouping. The republics of further to the east, the republics of Altai, Tuva, here's your trivia question for the day. Tuva, which borders Mongolia, was actually independent of the Soviet Union until 1944. And Buryatia are contiguous with Mongolia, and Khakassia is contiguous with them. A constellation of contiguous autonomous republics in Russia's Volga federal district, I'm going to name them here, Mordovia, Chuvashia, Maria El, Tatarstan, Udmurtia, and Bashkortostan, I love to say that word there, has no access to a foreign border. However, the distance from Bashkortostan's southern border to Kazakhstan is about 50 miles. And together, these republics have a population of more than 12 million. Tatarstan and Bashkortostan have oil and gas reserves, are rich in ferrous and non-ferrous metals, and Tatarstan is heavily industrialized. Therefore, many republics, alone, in federations or in confederations, could access the world economy with industrial potential and or natural resources to support their independence. So, as they say in Russian, в принципе, всё возможно. In principle, everything is possible. In principle, there could be economic viability for these autonomous republics if they wish to secede. Now, while the war in Ukraine might not lead to them breaking free from Russia, nothing I'm saying is deterministic, by the way. The Kremlin is already losing influence in the former Soviet republics in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Russia has withdrawn most of its men and equipment from the Far East garrisons, and bases provided security in Tajikistan, Armenia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. They still have some forces left there, but not many. It's like, if you think, you go back to your ancient history, it's like Rome's legions on Hadrian's Wall with Scotland. When they get the word in the 4th century, come on back. You're needed closer to the center in the empire. And you knew, and they knew as they were marching back, that they would never be coming back again. Russia's military withdrawals have already upended regional geopolitics, and the most recent example of this has been Azerbaijan's complete victory in Nagorno-Karabakh that was supposed to have been protected by Russian peacekeepers. I believe the greatest example of this geopolitical change happened a year ago this month. And this has not much attention has been paid to this, but I think in year 2022, the second most important thing that happened besides the invasion of Ukraine was this incident I'm going to describe now. Let us consider the October 2022 meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. The dominant figures at that meeting were President Xi Jinping of China and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, with Putin relegated to being either a supplicant for aid or a whipping boy for his war in Ukraine. This dramatic shift in power was highlighted a few days before in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, and this is the moment I was talking about, when President Xi of China visited Kazakhstan and spoke about its territorial integrity, which Russian pundits, lawmakers, and even Putin himself openly in 2014 have threatened. Xi, in a direct warning to Russia, stated in Kazakhstan that, and I'll quote here, "No matter how the international situation changes, China will always support Kazakhstan in maintaining its national independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity," unquote. With those 21 words, Xi signaled that China was now an arbiter of Central Asian security and had the power to back up its interest. Similarly, Turkey's help to Azerbaijan to defeat Russia's supported Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh made it an arbitrator of South Caucasus security issues. The presence of Xi and Erdogan in Samarkand was a ceremonial recognition of this reality and that Russia's unrestricted hegemony in its near abroad was over. Now, for my final point. And by the way, normally they tell you, turn off your cell phones or mute them or whatever. If you want to, take out your cell phones and, as I talk this next part, Google a map of Russia's far eastern federal district if you want, just to get an idea of the area we're looking at. This is cheap man's version of audiovisual effects. But if you want to, Russia's far eastern federal district. Okay. My third point is that China's assertion of its security interests in Central Asia was a humiliation for Russia. But the worst was not over for them, because Moscow must wonder if Beijing will be satisfied with hegemony or if it has greater ambitions based on Sino-Russian history replete with territorial conflicts. And here is the key to my thesis about will Russia survive till 2084. For 2 centuries, the 17th and the 18th, China parried Russian attempts to reach the Amur River Valley until the balance of power between the two empires changed, and the 1858 Treaty of Aigun and the 1860 Convention of Beijing recognized Russian control over the left bank of the Amur and the land known as the Maritime Province, which is where Vladivostok is located. Territorial conflicts continued at China's expense, with Russia's coercion of China in 1898 to lease Port Arthur, which then led to the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Russia's role in suppressing the Boxer Rebellion, U.S. Marines had a little bit to do in that too, the 1929 Sino-Soviet conflict over the Chinese Eastern Railway. Has anyone ever heard of this? Good for you. 1929, the Chinese and the Russians fought a 3-month war, which involved about 250,000 soldiers for control or maintaining the control of this railway that had previously been controlled by the Tsars and now was controlled by the Bolsheviks, who were not going to give it up. And then in 1934, there was a Soviet incursion into the far western Chinese province of Xinjiang to support a separatist warlord. And the Sino-Soviet split precipitating the 1969 border clashes I referred to at the beginning of my talk. Added to this history is the reality that the Chinese Communist Party is now legitimized not by Marxist-Leninism, but by ultranationalism, which emphasizes regaining lands lost during this quote-unquote century of humiliation. Now, we're familiar with this. Mostly, the current emphasis is on Taiwan. However, even in Mao's time, Beijing argued that the unequal treaties with Russia that I just mentioned, that forced it to cede 1 million square miles of territory, needed renegotiation, a demand that Khrushchev rejected. And by the way, Deng Xiaoping raised the same issue with Mikhail Gorbachev when they met in 1989, and he made sure that issue was, when they released the transcript of the talks, was included for the Chinese public to know. Could this issue rise again? What if China, we'll talk a couple scenarios here, what if China is rebuffed in a war over Taiwan and turns its attention north instead to save face? What if it conquers Taiwan and then decides to undo the last of the unequal treaties? Could the real 21st century Thucydides trap, that's the political science concept of an emerging power threatening to replace an established great power leading to war, what if the real 21st century Thucydides trap we read about will be a conflict between Russia and China over Far Eastern resources instead of a conflict between China and the United States over the Far East, or possibly both? If Russia faces a revanchist China, it will find itself hamstrung by demographic and economic weaknesses. Now, we've probably read recently about China's own problems, and they do exist economically and even now a bit demographically. But while China's population will gray into the 21st century as a result of its previous one-child policy, it will still hold a 10-to-1 population advantage over Russia. Russia's declining population is a strategic weakness for it, but so is where that population is located. Or, to be more exact, where the population is not located. The population of Russia's Far Eastern Federal District, which is twice the size of the Indian subcontinent, it makes up 40% of Russia's landmass, is less than 8 million people, or less than 6% of Russia's total population, while over 80 million Chinese live in just the 3 provinces that border the Far Eastern Federal District. This is a near demographic vacuum next to Siberia, or the Far Eastern Province. It's a demographic vacuum next to a demographic black hole. And I think what we should understand is that as this century unfolds, we are witnessing a great geopolitical experiment to determine how few Russians can live in this region and have it remained under Moscow's control. Added to the national security challenges to demography is the huge disparity between the Russian and Chinese economies. In 1991, 1992, the Russian and Chinese economies were about the same size. In 2021, China had the world's second largest economy, and Russia the world's 11th largest. Russia's gross domestic product will continue to stagnate until Western sanctions are lifted over Ukraine and Crimea, whenever that will be. Even when that finally happens, if it happens, the Russian economy now is so far behind China's that it cannot hope to match China, certainly I'll say in my lifetime, in Chinese economic might, which gives Beijing considerable conventional military advantage over Russia as well. Furthermore, as China's nuclear capacity reaches parity with Russia's, including a second strike capability, Moscow may be unable to depend on nuclear weapons to deter conflict. And then finally, thanks to Putin's foreign policy, Russia cannot depend on any allies of military significance. By making the West Russia's bête noire and invading Ukraine, Putin has precluded any sort of geographical balancing to future Eastern threats. Western liberal democracies may move to thwart Chinese ambition and aggression against a democratic Taiwan, but they have no incentive to do so for a Russia that has rejected the West and invaded and pillaged a country, Ukraine, wishing to join its institutions. So let me conclude with my question. Will Russia survive until 2084? Oh, to be sure, the scenario I've outlined for this article for Russia appears bleak. And I'd like to emphasize again, as I mentioned earlier, there's nothing deterministic in what I have written. I am not saying this will happen, I'm saying this could happen. And as my wife regularly reminds me, I could be wrong. I'll admit that. However, the numbers, the facts, I mean, let's look, again, a recap of what I've said here, what could possibly happen. And it's not out the realm of possibility. First, defeat in Ukraine leads to political chaos and possible civil war, allowing some autonomous republics to secede and accelerating Russia's loss of hegemony in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. As Russia's economy and demography continue to weaken, its military capability contracts, and traditional geopolitical rivals gain in strength, will Russia be able to maintain its massive territorial integrity or shrink back to a size commensurate with the last time such disasters afflicted Moscow? A secondary question is, will Russia want an intact Russia as a weak vassal, or Russia's Far East for itself? This is a drastic picture again, but one for which policymakers should plan for. Russia is a millennium-old civilization and cannot dissolve as the ideologically based Soviet Union did. But as a multinational state, it can get smaller. As a result of a combination of a military defeat, domestic political chaos, economic malaise, and continuing demographic decline, Russia's borders could implode to the extent they resemble those at close to the beginning of the 16th century, or at the close of the 16th century, known in Russia as the Time of Troubles. Thank you for listening to me.
Excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Mr. Wasielewski. We will have our Q. We've got plenty of time for the Q&A. It's a small room, but please wait for the microphone because we're trying to get a recording. 2 rules. Everybody gets 1 question. Don't try and trick me with multiple parts. If you want to go back to the end, you're welcome to. At 2, this is my microphone. You're going to be tempted to reach out and grab it. Do not do that, please. I will hold it where it needs to be. Where do we want to start? Plenty of time for Q&A. All right, I'm just going to start up here because it's closer, but then I'll come back to you, Randy.
You are saying that the Soviet Union is facing a demographic problem. I'm sorry, Russia.
We might as well go back to the old name anyway. So
Yeah. And I've heard that one of the things happening in the Ukraine war is that the Russians are taking Ukrainian children into Russia. Is this related to that, do you think?
First off, it's ghastly, and it is true, and it's been documented. So that is factual. Is it related to this? I'm not saying that there is a planned sort of reason for these kidnappings, but it follows into the basic mindset. It's Russia's war in Ukraine is an imperial war. It's based on Russia as an empire. There is a belief amongst the elites, the national security elites, but also amongst many of the common people that Ukraine does not exist, that Ukrainians have no agency, no ability to make their own decisions, that they are actually Russians, and therefore they should be under Moscow's control. So that is, part of, this war. If I can expand a little bit, some of the, people ask, why is the war in Ukraine important to the United States? And the demographic portion here, if Russia had succeeded with its initial plans in early 2022, it would have taken over most of Ukraine and then a supine Belarus. It would have recreated the most essential parts of the Soviet Union. And with Ukraine's population of about 44 million, this, and within with Belarus, this would have been a great solution to its demographic problems. Not only that, Ukraine has, next to Russia, is one of the second largest agricultural exporters, great mineral resources, military-industrial complex, the rockets, the ships for the Black Sea Fleet, missiles, many of these built for the Soviet military came from Ukraine. So what we would have had as this century unfolds, if this initial attack in Ukraine had worked, instead of, as the United States goes into the century facing a regional revanchist or revisionist power in Europe, Russia, and a superpower, China, in the East, both of which wanting to undo the rules-based system, we would be facing, as time went on, two superpowers, revisionist superpowers, trying to undo the rules-based system that we benefit from. And so, yes, in a way, a successful invasion of Ukraine, and then with time, a generation, incorporating its population would have solved demographic problems. For those of you, I kept talking about Russia's demographic problems. One more thing. Russia says in its own statistics that its population is 147 million, which is actually 1 million less than last year, or 800,000. UN data says 143. The most recent CIA fact book says 141. Putin, when he was in Buryatia this March, made a slip of the tongue, and he said only 25 million, excuse me, what was it? Maybe said only 25 million Russians or something like that live east of the Ural Mountains. That's Siberia and the Far Eastern districts. Well, their official statistics say 37 million live east. So did he slip by just getting his figures mixed up? Or did he slip by telling what the real figures were? He was missing 12 million people. So Russia's population now could be 130 million, roughly. And what is the problem with Russia's demographic problem is not that it's the reproduction rates. For per woman, a society needs to have 2.1 births per woman to maintain its population size. Right now, for women, it's about 1.5 in Russia, a little bit less. But also that's higher in the Muslim autonomous districts. Now, that's not bad in itself. That's about what it is in Western Europe or even in many other countries. The problem with Russia's demographic crisis is the number of deaths far outpassing births. And so that is why the population continues to decline each year. So I hope that answers your question. Kind of a broad way, that gave me an excuse to talk about a number of things about the demography of Russia.
Here we are.
It is alcohol abuse, it is AIDS, it is poor health care, it is heart disease, it is accidents. The secret's out. He said I graduated from Penn in '83. So I'm 62. My life expectancy as a Russian male pretty much would be over in many cases. For women, it's about 10 years higher. Also for young men. And by the way, Russia, in own statistics, it has lost 1 million young men that either have died in the war, are serving now in Ukraine, or have fled Russia. Okay? So not serving the war. And most of these are very highly educated people. So within your gene pool of people who of reproductive age, you've already removed another 1 million men from that group. That is going to show up in live births this year and next year in Russia. And the reason you have a problem birth rate in Russia is because the people, men and women, were not born 20 years ago. So this is a problem that keeps cascading, demographic problems. They're not easily solved. And it cannot solve it as the United States and some other countries are able to because we're a nation of immigrants. And Russia does not have that option.
All right, you're in the back of the room.
Yeah, so, Randy Noonan from Penn State. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about Chechnya, because I know that's one factor of kind of the symptom maybe of the collapse of the old order, in that they have their own military forces and run by their own warlord, and now we're wondering what the health of that warlord is and what the future there is. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Professor. If you go on, if you are on the front lines in Ukraine, you will hear Chechen spoken on some portions of the front line. But you will hear Chechen spoken on the Ukrainian side, and you will hear Chechen spoken on the Russian side, because there are Chechen units fighting as part of the Russian Federation, but not part of its army. And you have Chechen units fighting for the Ukrainians as part of its international legion. And this is part of the conundrum. For Chechnya, which is pretty much as autonomous as you can get in Russia today without leaving the country, its leader has been one of Putin's most loyal supporters, at least openly. And he has his own forces, which are, again, are not subservient to the Ministry of Defense. They report to him. But you still have, even though the Chechen resistance was pretty much crushed by the early 2000s, you still have the raw materials for another resistance. And a couple of things. One is, and there has been reports, if you read the newsletters and that specialize in the Caucasus, there has been an uptick in violence within Chechnya against the government. But remember, Chechnya is very much a tribal society. The tribes are called tapes or clans, and there's over 100 of them. Kadyrov is only a leader of one of those clans, one of those tapes. And so he has butchered a number of his own countrymen to seize power and to maintain power. In the North Caucasus, and I've served in the Caucasus, if you think there are feuds in West Virginia, wait till you go to the Caucasus, because all those people that he's murdered have relatives still, and there is a tradition of revenge. So if Russia was to, as I say in my thesis, this is one of the reasons, if Russia is to disintegrate, if there is civil war, unrest in Moscow, and Russia cannot support Kadyrov, and Kadyrov's not able to hold off on his own, then other armed elements could begin a civil war also in Chechnya. And this is not unimaginable. We've seen it before. And remember, it took hundreds of thousands of Russian troops to conquer and to stop the last Chechen war. Those troops aren't there anymore. They're either all on the line of contact with Ukraine, or they're dead. In 1999, I think, I got a chance to meet with the foreign minister in exile of Chechnya. I was in graduate school. I was doing, my master's thesis was on the future separatism in the North Caucasus, and I asked him, what's the possibility of there being further outbreaks of secessionism in the other North Caucasus republics? And he said, none. There's a field army right now parked, in the North Caucasus. That field army is gone. And if the Russian army, such as it is now in Ukraine, was to fall apart, the security services would be engaged in trying to keep order within Russia itself. So not only in Chechnya, but many of these other republics, there's a chance that ethnic leaders could take advantage, or secessionist groups, to have another outbreak of a Chechen-like war for secession. And the challenge for us in the policy question is, what if the original Chechen secessionist movement was nationalist, led by Zhokar Dadayev? He had been a general in the Soviet army. He was not an Islamic fundamentalist. As a matter of fact, there's a story that when he just took power, he says, and we're going to be an Islamic country. Matter of fact, we should pray 3 times a day. Well, those of you who know the tenets of Islam, you pray 5, yes. And someone nudged him and said, General, 5 times a day. And he says, yes, the more the merrier. All right? This was not an Islamist fundamentalist. But as years went by, that revolution was hijacked by the Islamic fundamentalists. What do we do in these Muslim republics if they do rise up and they're hijacked again by the Muslim fundamentalism, the violent Salafist extremists? We see that motivates Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas now. So it's a very good question. So if Russia falls apart, again, my thesis is these autonomous Muslim republics, most of which have borders along foreign countries, will be tempted to secede again. Whether they decide to do so or not is going to depend on local circumstances, local leaderships, and whether the people, like I said, believe that they can succeed or not, both economically and not get crushed by Russia.
Once more from the back of the room, and then I'll start working my way forward. Would love to get some questions from our students while you're here, so maybe get one ready.
Okay, the question I had was, you said that Russia had basically burned its bridges with the West as far as dealing with Chinese and other threatening incursions. And I think that's probably true for the Putin government and his immediate followers. But if you actually have a change in government, like say, for example, you did in West Germany between 1945 and 55, do you think it'd be possible that a future Russian government might seek alliance with the West, aka the US and NATO?
Will we see a Russia with that's basically non-imperial, is another way of stating your question. Because as you said Putin and others, because whoever may follow Putin belongs to the same national security elites with the same outlooks. And as I described earlier, it's an imperial outlook. I do not believe, I'm kind of like Amalric. I think grassroots real reform is, grassroots rebellion and real reform is not going to happen. It's just not part of Russia today. I mean, the opposition that did exist has either been thrown in jail or exiled. So I don't think we would see that sort of from the grassroots. I think that for its national identity to change from non-imperial from imperial to non-imperial, it would take some great event. Now, this is why many are saying we have to help Ukraine, because only a major defeat will cause Russia to rethink its national identity and be less imperial. When I was in Ukraine this summer, I was talking to many Ukrainians, and they said, this is why we want Crimea back. Putin can't spin losing Crimea. He loses Crimea, he's lost the war. And so if the Russians lose the war, it will be a major shock to them. And they mentioned, just as Germany and Japan had to reevaluate their national identity after being crushed in World War II, the same may happen to Russia if it's defeated in this war. Now, they all know with nuclear weapons and the size of Russia, no one's going to occupy Russia like we occupied Germany and Japan. However, a major crushing blow could cause public to reevaluate that. I think that's a little optimistic, actually, because I don't think even losing the war in Ukraine would cause them to be less imperial. I think instead of reform, you would have revanchism. And a desire to just rebuild the army and try and get Crimea back in another 20 years. What I think would require China to actually take over large portions of the Russian Far East. That sort of defeat could make the Russians, both the national security elites and the average citizens, rethink their imperial identity and realize that their future is in the West. It's kind of a conundrum in that Russia does not consider itself a Western country. It considers it, depending on sui generis. There's a political science theory that's gained a lot of emphasis in Russia over the past 20 years called Eurasianism, that Russia is both part West, part of the East, but it's something totally unique to both. And that's kind of a shame because in the Western canon of Western culture, our Western culture would not be complete with all the contributions that come from Russia. You think of literature, our literature. from the Golden Age, Tolstoy, Lermontov, Pushkin, painters like Repin, music, Tchaikovsky, and Rimsky-Korsakov. Architecture. I could go on and on. So the Western culture is not complete without Russia being in there. But for Russia, it does not, despite all these contributions to Western culture, it does not consider itself part of the West. And I don't think will until it faces an existential threat. And the only existential threat it can be provided right now comes from China. So forgive the kind of convoluted and long-winded answer, but that's what I would foresee would take for a change of national identity from imperial to non-imperial.
And here we are to your left with our next question.
Do you think civilization in general will survive till 2084?
Yes. Don't worry. It'll still, and you will too. Because by the way, I really covered myself, because I'd be 123, I think, in 2084. So if this prediction does not wake out, I'm covered. No, to be serious, one nice advantage of studying history is you realize that there are cycles to history, and things have always looked grim and bleak. There have always, as it says in the good book, there have always been wars and rumors of war. But do not let your heart be troubled, as it says in another part of the good book. Yes, we have many challenges, but I grew up in the 60s. Those of us who remember the 1960s in the United States, if we think we have domestic turmoil now, we still don't have millions of people marching in the streets, anti-war, bombings, all sorts of things going on, assassinations of top leaders. And if you go back before, look at the 1850s, what this country went through, not only with the, leading up to the Civil War, but you had the Know Nothing movement, all the violence against immigrants and that. Yes, there have always been challenges in this country and in the world, but the nice thing is that humans, which create the world's problems, all sort pretty good at creating the solutions until the next set of problems come around, and that's just called the cycle of life. So.
All right, same side of the room. I'm in the back corner here. I've got a couple questions queued up in the opposite corner here, and two in the middle of the room. So that's the direction I'm going to be working, and we'll try and get a couple more in.
Are the Bidens investing in any of the other former republics of the Soviet Union?
I have no idea. I think I know where your question is coming from, but tell you the truth. FPRI is a nonpartisan think tank. I'm an apolitical person. I have served in the White House under both Republicans and Democrats, and also I have contact with I worked on the Hill, so that has made me totally apolitical. So I really don't get into those sorts of questions. Thank you.
All the way to your right now.
I don't think I'm breaking any new ground here by saying that Vladimir Putin's not a very nice guy, but he certainly hasn't gone as far as to use nuclear weaponry yet. So my question is, should there be a power struggle, a power vacuum in Russia in the coming years, what's to stop the use of nuclear weapons from devastating the region?
Let me ask you to clarify that a little bit more. Do you mean him unleashing a nuclear weapon on Ukraine, or nuclear weapons getting loose during the time of civil war in Russia?
I was thinking more of nuclear weapons getting loose, but I suppose whichever one you could answer, I would appreciate.
Okay. That is a very good question. And as I wrote in my paper, that is one of the other policy considerations we should be prepared for. However, it is, and to get back to the earlier question here, it's not unprecedented. That is the same problem and fear we faced in 1991 as the Soviet Union began to fall apart. What would happen to the nuclear weapons? There are, channels, we have with the Russian government still, as bad as we are. And one of the key things is to always keep channels of communication open in case such things happen. There are other things we can do, probably not for this forum to discuss, but it is something that we should plan for. But what I would recommend that we not do is we not take counsel on our fears and we not self-deter by fears of what could happen. If the Russian Federation, which is also an empire, falls apart, if the people in charge of the empire cannot keep it together, there's nothing we can do with our power to keep it together for them. So that would happen. And then the thing to do would be to make sure that we have the lines of communication open with our counterparts to make sure that those weapons still remain under control. And it worked in 1991, 92, and it can work again. By the way, nuclear weapons, both in this country and in Russia, are very closely controlled, and the controls on them are not insignificant. So there is at least that. Now the question is, what happens if the people guarding the weapons are involved in civil war? That is a real threat and fear. But it is an unknown, but it is not. It is something we have faced before, and we've successfully been able to take care of that. So for the first time, Russia fell apart.
Right here in the front of the room.
How does Russia recruit? Excuse me, for the armed forces, and do they, for example, from the east versus the west, is there an issue there? Mm-hmm. And also, if there's a standard method, do people try to overcome the method?
Well, as far as I'll go to the last first. Trying to overcome the method. My dad, when he finally got his draft notice, was thought of everything he could possibly do not to get drafted. He didn't want to go in, but eventually he did, which is good because that's where he met, my mom in the army. But yes, evading the draft is not unique to Russia. But to get to your question, answer how is the Russian army recruited? Okay, any other army or most other armies, they got two systems. One is conscripts, and one is volunteers. Conscripts, twice a year, a call-out goes for young men to be conscripted into the Russian military. Not just the army, but the whole military, also their border guards, other paramilitary forces. As the draft evasion of that is almost a national sport, amongst young men. But so far they have been able to get enough people for conscripts. Now, technically, since Russia has not declared war in Ukraine, those conscripts are not supposed to be able to go to Ukraine, okay? But as my Marines would once tell me from time to time at Camp Lejeune, my recruiter lied to me. Once you're in, the Russian army as a conscript, especially now, you are going to be under great pressure, really great pressure, to sign a contract, okay, so that you can be sent. Oh, and by the way, even if you don't sign the contract, you'll probably be sent, and what are you going to do about it? Now the volunteers, and this is, a few of my trip report from my trip to Ukraine covers some of this. There's a few copies floating around here. Volunteers, the Russian army used to be 2/3 volunteers and 1/3 conscripts. Okay, they're not going to be able to maintain that, but they are still getting volunteers because of a couple of reasons. One is patriotism. Some, men, their country's been attacked. Another is the great amount of financial incentives. And this gets to your next question, where are they recruiting them from? They're not bringing them from St. Petersburg and from Moscow, and I'll get into why in a few minutes. They are recruiting them from the east, the poor villages and towns where they have no other future, and they are offering amounts of money that no young Russian male would be able to earn on his own. And by the way, there's a great article on this. I footnoted in there. I can't remember the author right off the top of my head, but he's worked it out so that for a man in his 30s, mid-30s, who volunteers and gets killed, the death payment his family gets would be equal to his lifetime of working ages from age 30 to about age 60. So it's actually, and the author of the article makes a great point, Putin has actually made it economically sensible to die in the Russian army, or at least to risk your life. Take the chance. So that is how it's done. But most of the recruiting is done, like I said, in these ethnic republics, and a lot of them resent it. And it's not being done in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Because as one Russian general starts, revolutions only happen in the capital in Russia. So they don't want, a lot of men resisting the draft or holding anti-war demonstrations in those two cities that then get out of hand. They know their Russian history well, too.
Just here on your left, I've got probably what's going to be our last 3 or 4 questions already queued up, so if I don't come to you, please don't be offended.
So you discussed a war potentially breaking out between Russia and China, and my question is, do you believe the United States would side with Russia, China, or would they choose to stay out of it?
God, I hope we would stay out of it. Couple of reasons. I was able to attend something in Washington yesterday. We're coming into a very interesting period of history in that up until now, the nuclear balance, which has maintained peace between Russia and the United States or Soviet Union and United States, has always been bipolar. We're about to enter into a tripolar era as China enlarges its strategic nuclear forces. I do not see, if China was to make some sort of move against Russia's Far East, where we would get involved militarily. And I hope we would not. However, if that was to happen, that would certainly change the world. Now that China would have those resources to be able to depend upon. As I predicted, I think that would be the only thing that would change Russia's orientation and move it back to realizing it is a Western country and wanting to ally with the West and then, NATO or something like that. But it would be a much smaller Russia. And as I said, if you look at your historical maps, it would be Russia's borders at about the time of troubles, at the beginning of the 1600s.
All right, I'm on your back left again. I'll be heading all the way to the other side of the room, but we'll start right here.
Hi, so I'm a German teacher. I watch Deutsche Welle news often. They've been talking recently about Latvia reinforcing and bringing in more military because they're afraid that Russia's coming for them next. Mm-hmm. And the other Baltic states have already beefed up their military. Do you think are their fears realistic?
Yes. Yeah. I did a tour after Ukraine. I did a tour of many of the states between the Black and Baltic Seas this summer. And in all, except for Hungary, there is a palpable fear of being attacked by Russia. Military attack, direct invasion, air attack, cyber attack. And it's happened to them. Latvia, Estonia have suffered cyber attacks. Georgia was invaded by the ground. Moldova, from its border, is just 100 miles to the front. So there is a palpable fear of Russian invasion in some ways. When I was in the Baltics, on the one hand, there was a kind of a phew, because they figure now Russia does not have the conventional strength to invade the Baltics. When I was on the National Security Council staff, this is open, this has been published in the press, there was a war game done of how we would react to a Russian invasion of the Baltics. And without giving away the results, the realization was we could, at that time, not stop a Russian invasion of the Baltics. They would run over the whole Baltics. We'd have to fight to get it back. Now, although Russia's military has been severely attrited in Ukraine, that does not mean it's still without capability. Because Russia, no matter what its size is, 147 or 137 million, is next to countries that are 2.3 million, 1.7 million, 1.5 million, if I've got it right, for the 3 Baltic nations. And as far as Russia has gotten into Ukraine in this war, if you were to take that and overlay it on the Baltics, that would reach Tallinn in Estonia, Riga in Latvia, and it would Vilnius is in an artillery range of Belarus, and it would get to Klaipėda, it's port on the Baltic. In other words, they would roll over. And even though we know that in a war with NATO, and Russia knows this too, or should, that we would force them out, they would lose the war, the death and destruction that would accompany that would be just incredible. Look what happened in Mariupol. Look what they did in Aleppo. And when I was in Vilnius, this was a great fear, is that even though Lithuania would be on the winning side of a war, it would be destroyed. Remember how, and this isn't just me just saying, look at how Russia has fought its wars. Look how it's fought it in Afghanistan. How many Afghans were killed? How many were made refugees? Okay? When you have a country, of 1.5 million, you can't take a couple of million dead like the Afghans did. So their fear is that not that the Russians would occupy them for 50 years again like they did between 1940 and 1951, but it would be like a punitive expedition. They roll in, they get pushed out. No one's, we're not going to go to Moscow, but Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are destroyed and their populations decimated. When I left one meeting with a foreign affairs expert, Lithuanian, in Vilnius, his last words to me were, remember, Article 5 is what guarantees our existence. Yes, NATO Article 5, the article that an attack, just to oversimplify it, an attack on one is an attack on all and to be responded to.
And here we are on your right.
So concerning like Russia and Turkey, between Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia, do you think that, do you foresee a conflict possibly occurring there?
In the South Caucasus?
Yeah.
In those three countries? No, for two reasons. There's no reason. Azerbaijan, by military force, has solved the Nagorno-Karabakh frozen conflict. It has been solved, and Armenia has pretty much accepted it and recognized that. By the way, think of that when you're reading in editorials, well, there's no military solution. There's only, we have to try a political solution. Azerbaijan had a military solution. So that frozen conflict is solved. The concern is, if you break out your cell phones again, if you look at the maps of Armenia and Azerbaijan, here's Azerbaijan, here's Armenia, but there's a little slice of Azerbaijan here called Nakhichevan. I've mispronounced it. And that's, by the way, where the Haidar, the president's family is from. And there is fear that Azerbaijan may try and conquer a corridor across there, which the Iranians would be very much against. But that remains to be seen. Hopefully cooler heads will prevail. In Georgia, Georgia's not a party to that conflict. In Georgia right now, its government, basically there's been something, what you look in political science, called state capture. Okay, through weaponization of corruption, information operations, other things like that, what's known as political warfare. Moscow's been able to pretty much capture Georgia's government and make it pro-Moscow. So, and it occupies 20% of Georgian territory in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So, to answer your question, for a couple of reasons, we have stability in the South Caucasus at this time. Knowing the Caucasus pretty well and having lived there, I can only say that it won't be forever. Okay.
Thank you so much for coming to spend the time today. We have another round of applause for Mr. Philip Wasielewski.
Thanks for doing that.